The king has to look impartial. I mean, in this dispute between Mowbray and Bolingbroke, and that's difficult, but nonetheless, he has to look impartial. And he gives an interesting version of his impartiality in that Act 1, Scene 1. This is lines 115. Mowbray, when Mowbray brings up the fact that I might be at a disadvantage here because this is your nephew I'm in a dispute with, and he says, Mowbray, impartial are my eyes and ears. Were he my brother, nay, my kingdom's heir. In short, were he my son, as he is but my father's brother's son, now by my scepter's awe I make a vow, such neighbor nearness to our sacred blood should nothing privilege him, nor partialize the unstooping firmness of my upright soul. He is our subject, Mowbray, so art thou. Free speech and fearless eye to thee allow. In short, what Richard says, and of course we've always got to be cynical about such things a bit, is I am so committed to being king, and I am a divine king, that I would choose that role over my own family. I would commit myself, or I am already committed, to that divine otherness in a way that supersedes my commitment to my own blood, even my own son. Even though this king does not have a son, this is his nephew. Here he figures as his son. We've just heard a lot about this in Titus Andronicus, right, where Shakespeare theorizes about the commitment to a state or an idea or a god versus the commitment to one's own. So when the trial by combat scene comes up, and this moves us ahead to Act 1, Scene 3, Richard lets it go forward as if it's going to happen, and then interrupts it. Immediately interrupts it just as things are going to get interesting or seem to get interesting. Lines 124 and says, "Draw near and list what with our counsel we have done, from that our kingdom's earth should not be soiled with that dear blood which it has fostered." In short, I'm not going to let this take place. We have made a decision. Richard has made a decision with counsel here, and keep in mind, this is standard administrative practice, right? The CEO goes to the board of directors, or the school superintendent goes to the board of education. We distribute responsibility across the board so that any given individual in a hierarchy has some buffer or some protection. In other words, it wasn't just me making this decision. And he says to Hereford, he says, this is Harry Hereford, Henry Bolingbroke, lots of names in this play, who will become Henry IV. He says, "You are banished for twice 5 summers, 10 years." Mowbray gets a heavier sentence. He is banished for life. Banished for life. And as he says, I can't just go to another country. I can't pick up at age 40 and go to another country. I don't speak the language. I don't have rank. Banishment at that period is a terrible crime. But this solves the dispute, or seems to solve the dispute, at least from Richard's perspective. But once Mowbray leaves the stage and we're left on stage alone with Henry and his council and John of Gaunt, and Hereford, Gaunt is visibly upset. And this is unusual. Again, Gaunt is this established statesman, a trained diplomat, a courtier who knows how to hide his emotions. He doesn't go off the deep end. He keeps his true feelings concealed. But somehow on stage, he's crying or visibly upset, and this is indicated to us by the lines 208. "Uncle, even in the glasses of thine eyes I see thy grieved heart, thy sad aspect hath the number of the banished years plucked for away." So in other words, we immediately reduces Bolingbroke's banishment down to 6 years. But Gaunt said, that's not enough. Gaunt says, I thank you, that's great, but I'm old. By the time he gets back, I'll be dead. And Richard says, well, that kind of thing we say to all old people when they remind us that they're going to die soon, which they know. "Why, uncle, thou hast many years to live." And Gaunt, in a very striking moment, turns on the king here in an undiplomatic way. He says, "But not any years you can give." In other words, Gaunt here points out to Richard the limits of his power, something always risky to do to a king, even if it's true. "But not a minute, king, that thou canst give. Shorten my days thou canst with sullen sorrow, but you can't give me any more breath." Um, and King Richard takes offense at this. He says, "Thy son is banished upon good advice, whereto thy tongue a party verdict gave." And this is interesting. All of a sudden, an audience discovers that Gaunt played a role, or at least agreed, to the banishment of his own son. In other words, he agreed with Richard with this strategy. He agreed to sacrifice his own son for the good of the king. And so Richard says to him, why at our justice themes thou then to lour? And when he says our there, it's not just the royal we, it's meaning you were part of this committee decision. And now you're backpacking? Or backtracking, I guess. And God says quite honestly, well, that's because things sweet to taste prove in digestion sour. I'm at lines 235. You urged me as a judge, but I had rather you would have bid me argue like a father. Or had it been a stranger, not my child, to smooth his fault, I should have been more mild. In short, had it not been my kid, I wouldn't have exacted this kind of punishment. He says, I sought to avoid in the committee the appearance of impartiality towards my son. In other words, I chose my role as a statesman over my role as a father. A partial slander sought I to avoid, and in the sentence mine own life destroyed. And then he looks to the other council members and says, in effect, where were you guys to help me out? I looked when some of you should say I was too strict to make mine own away, but you gave me leave to my unwilling tongue against my will to do myself this wrong. I looked for some help for you guys to bail me out, and it didn't come. And now what Gaunt realizes after the effect is that he has, in effect, agreed to sacrifice his own son for the king. And that's one of those things where you kind of say, it might have seemed like a good idea at the time, but when we actually have to live with the consequences of those hard decisions, that's a different story. Things sweet to taste in digestion can feel a bit more sour. In other words, we might claim great ideals. We will be loyal either to the state of Rome or here King Richard II, even if it means sacrificing our family. But when we actually have to sacrifice our family, that feels different. And Gaunt complains about that, or feels about that, in a way, quite frankly, that Titus didn't.